A lot of people do that, right? If they're already having, say, an emotional affair with somebody on the side and they just want to be sort of in the okay to do that, then they'll say, hey, what about this? And then their partner says, yeah, maybe so. And they're like, okay, cool, because I have somebody.
Hey, everybody. Before we start the show, I want to make a couple disclaimers. This show does cover a wide variety of topics related to mental health and life in general, and some of those could be sensitive for you. I want to simultaneously encourage you to be brave in consuming difficult content, but also respect and recognize your limitations. So please use your best judgment. I will never be offended if you need to skip a question or an episode entirely, but feel free to feel it out, check out the episode, and just see what happens. If you need to skip, that's okay, but feel free to give it a shot first. I also need to say that while I am a psychologist, I'm not your psychologist, and I'm not your therapist. This is not intended to be direct medical advice, and you should not use this as a substitute for professional help. So with those said, let's go ahead and get into the show.
All right. Hello, friends of all varieties. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast, episode 366. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff, aka Duff the Psych. I make mental health content for real people, just like you. And today I have a question and answer episode. Two really interesting questions. One about relationships and my relationships. Another one about losing a pet. So that's kind of what we're going to be getting into today. Hopefully it goes smoothly. I actually tried to record earlier tonight and it just didn't work. That happens occasionally. There's a variety of things. My notes app wasn't working on the computer, so I had to try to, look at my notes on my phone, which felt a little odd. And then I just kept screwing up and flubbing things I was trying to say. And eventually I was like, fuck it. I'm just going to do this again later. So here we are. This is take 2, and hopefully it's a little bit smoother this time. But yeah, I don't have too much to say up front. I hope that you guys are taking good care of yourselves wherever you are. I hope that you are, if you're listening to this live, going into a really nice weekend. Get some rest, recover for the next week, and let's just jump into the questions. Oh yeah, if you want to send me a question for the show, please send me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com or go to duffthepsych.com and use the contact form there to submit. Either way works, and I appreciate all the questions I've gotten recently. So here's the first question for this episode. It says, you've mentioned the change in your marriage into a non-monogamous polyamorous relationship. How did that initial conversation even start? Who initiated this conversation? I'm a queer woman married to a man, and I really miss sleeping with other women sometimes. I've considered opening my marriage before, but I can't imagine how to have that conversation without my husband feeling inadequate, insecure, and hurt. So hello, thank you. Really good question. I appreciate it. Let me first talk about my context. Let me talk about what my relationships are like right now, just for anybody that's unfamiliar. I know that I've been open about my relationship style being, polyamorous, and I speak about it freely on the show, but it's been a while since I've kind of talked about specifics, and I want to make sure that everything's clear before answering the specific question, so you know where I'm coming from. And for any of my family that might be listening, parents, etc., let's not listen to this one. You can just skip forward, 20 minutes or skip the episode entirely, please, and thank you. So, yeah, my relationship with my wife, who I have been with since I was 15 years old. So we met when I was a sophomore in high school, and we have been together without any breaks ever since. And so we've been married for 13 years. We've been together since I was 15. We've been married for 13 years. So we've been together for quite some time now. And, over time, our relationship has developed into one that is non-monogamous. So monogamous meaning, one person and another person, and they exclusively see each other romantically, sexually, however you want to define the relationship. It's just with one person and another. So non-monogamous meaning not that. And so, yeah, there are a lot of terms in the sort of non-monogamy world that I want to clarify a bit because it can be very confusing. The first one would be the umbrella term of non-monogamy. So non-monogamy is just what it sounds like, right? Anything that's not monogamous. But in practice, a lot of people will use the term ethical non-monogamy or even consensual non-monogamy to describe this. And that's a way to basically make it clear that it's not cheating. It's not just cheating. Although I'll be clear that cheating is possible within polyamory, within forms of non-monogamy, essentially cheating, there's no one specific, definition for it. It's not one thing. Cheating is essentially anything that's outside of the relationship agreement, outside of the boundaries of your relationship. So you can certainly still cheat within a non-monogamous relationship. But people say, non-monogamy, ethical non-monogamy as a means to say, hey, this is not that. So if you're on a dating app or a website, on message boards, Reddit, what have you, and you see people talking about it, they might abbreviate it as ENM, and then less commonly these days CNM. But ENM meaning ethical non-monogamy, and that's usually the person trying to signal that, everything's above board, there isn't something shady going on. And ENM can be sexual in nature, or it could be romantic. It could be both. It could be neither. It could be anything along those spectrums. However you would define a relationship with somebody, that's what that means, right? So meaning that you have that or potentially have that with more than one person. I want to be also very clear about the fact that there are people out there who misuse the term, right? So people will claim to be, practicing ENM, or they'll have that in their dating profile, when really it's a coercive situation where their partner has been given sort of an ultimatum and they're along for the ride, but they don't really want to be there. Or there are people who, are just trying to be a fuckboy with no consequences or no regard for the rights of other people that they come into contact with, right? And there's nothing wrong with having casual sex or casual relationships, but sometimes people use the term ENM to kind of claim to be something that they're not. So I would say if you are in the dating pool and thinking about this, or you're communicating with somebody who is, explaining that they, have an ENM lifestyle or something of that sort, be sure to clarify what they mean by that, because it's not always so clear just from that one statement. So underneath the umbrella of non-monogamy, there are various types of relationships and styles of, just living and having, relationships. So for example, you guys have probably heard the term swingers before. At least I'm sure many of you have. And swingers is something that has been, more within the public's purview for quite a long time, from 50s, 60s is when it, first kind of started becoming a term, I think, or at least a term that people knew in the United States. But basically it refers to people that are in couples and they have sexual experiences with other couples, but only within that context. So they might go to, parties where they get together with other couples. Sometimes they swap, sometimes they don't. There's a lot of different permutations of that. Maybe they go on special cruises or kind of vacations, things like that. But they don't date people or have romantic relationships outside of their relationship. It's just about, when they're together in this separate context. So that would be what swinging is. So that's one type of non-monogamy. There are other types. I'm not going to get into everything because that would be way too long. But you wanted to talk about polyamory. And, there's a little bit of debate over the terminology even related to polyamory. But basically the way that I define it is when somebody has or is at least open and willing to have multiple romantic partners at once. And that's what my relationship looks like. Now, there are some people who would go as far as to say that, polyamory is like a sexual orientation. I wouldn't go that far. I think that there are a lot of people who say, oh, well, I could never be polyamorous and this person can. So therefore, it's like an orientation. I'm not so sure. And I think that a lot of people try to use polyamory. A lot of straight people try to use polyamory as a way to sort of wedge into like LGBTQ spaces, and I don't really like that. So yeah, as far as I'm concerned, polyamory simply means when somebody has or is open to having multiple romantic partners at once. And so, my relationship is what I would consider a polyamorous one. So my wife is what you would call my nesting partner. It's another term there. So nesting partner, kind of what it sounds like. We have a home together, meaning the nest, right? So we have a home, we have children, we have a life we built together, shared bank accounts, all the shared history and all of that, right? So she's my nesting partner. And then I also have a girlfriend that I see at least once a week. I just got off the phone with her right now. I'll be seeing her tomorrow and then again on Saturday. And this is a separate relationship. This is not part of my relationship with my wife. Now, my wife and girlfriend have become great friends, and they will hang out on their own sometimes. We all hang out together. On Saturday, we'll all be here at the house together. But the two of them, they don't have a romantic relationship. They are what you would call metamors. So metamor is another term within the, kind of polyamorous ENM I don't know what to call it, vernacular. And metamor means basically the partner of your partner. So if my wife was dating somebody seriously, they would be my metamor. So yeah, they don't date each other. They don't have a romantic relationship. But there have been situations that were like that in the past. In the past, my wife and I have dated people together where we were in more of what you would call a triad situation. So that means that, between the three of us, there is romantic and sexual attraction and interaction every different way. So it's not like it's, two people are aligned and then two other people are aligned. It would be what you consider a triad. So it goes all directions. And not every polyamorous relationship is a triad or what you might call a throuple, even though that is what you tend to see in the media, right? So on TV shows, movies, I know that on there was a couple, maybe it was a new Gossip Girl or something. There was a couple recent shows that had, triads or thruples in them. And then, there are movies like I can remember Vicky Cristina Barcelona, where there was a bit of that happening. Lots of different things where they present that as sort of the primary version of polyamory. And it's not. There are a lot of people who would like it to be. It's very, very beneficial to particularly, straight men who have a partner who is bisexual or pansexual, and we'll talk more about that. But truly, there are many, many different ways that polyamory could look. That's just one way. Honestly, like I said, there's so many terms that I could get into here. I'm only going to throw out a few more just to give context about my situation, because I want to make sure that, we're on the same page here. The next thing I want to get into is the concept of hierarchy. But before I do that, I want to take a quick break and talk about today's sponsor. Okay, this episode is brought to you by OneSkin. Very pleased that OneSkin is back as a sponsor for the show, because I have continued using their product daily since I did the initial reads for it. OneSkin is a skincare brand that is powered by a revolutionary peptide that they created. And this peptide is called OS01, and it's been scientifically proven to target aged, or what we call senescent cells. So rather than just focusing on moisturizing, it actually targets the aged cells and eliminates them. They have done some serious science for this, and they stained skin samples in their lab looking for senescent cells, and then analyzing changes to the skin's genetic data before and after exposure to their peptide. And the scientists found that the peptide reverses skin's biological age by reducing the number of those senescent cells by up to 50%. There was actually an outside study that was a 12-week clinical study, and they found that wrinkles were diminished in 87% of users. Now, I'm not too concerned about, signs of aging on my face, but many people are. I'm concerned about a face that looks like it's being taken care of, that it's not just been run through the ringer. And I can say that with their very, very simple 2-step process. They just sent me 2 products, one for the eyes, one for the face, boom, boom, super quick, super easy. I can see a difference. And it also encourages me to make other good lifestyle choices to continue that progress. So if this sounds interesting to you, definitely check out OneSkin at oneskin.co. And right now, our listeners can get 15% off OneSkin with the code DUFF. So use the code DUFF at oneskin.co for 15% off your order. All right, back to the question. So I was talking about hierarchy. This is particularly relevant for situations like mine, where there was an existing relationship that transitioned from monogamous to non-monogamous, which is a process that people often refer to as opening up, right? So you've opened up your relationship. And when that happens, a lot of people have a very clear hierarchy in their relationship. They might call the partner that they've been with for a long time, that they nest with, their primary partner. Personally, I hate that terminology because it feels very dehumanizing to anybody else involved, right? Like I wouldn't call my girlfriend my secondary partner. That feels very fucked up to me. So I try, for my situation, very hard to not be overtly hierarchical and have that mindset in the relationships. But of course, I do need to recognize that there is an inherent difference in that, like I said, I live with my wife. We have this history together. We have a life we built together. And, that can't be ignored. To me, it's sort of like recognizing things like privilege or things like a power dynamic, just kind of understanding what you're coming into a situation with and not denying it, but trying to work with it. So essentially, the way I think of it is kind of like in law, where you have de facto, meaning, how things are in fact, just sort of the circumstances of it, versus de jure, meaning prescripted by law. So the hierarchy, and the hierarchical elements are not de jure. I don't, want that to be a part of it. But, in the de facto sense, there are certain things that kind of do pop up, like if something's happening with the kids, whatever, it can get in the way of, existing plans with my girlfriend or something like that. So it's something to sort of consider and work with. And everybody has a different way of going about this. I try to de-emphasize the hierarchy as much as possible. And, like I said, that's the spirit of my relationship. So my girlfriend or any other partners that I've had are not any less important to me. They're not any less in a relationship with me. So yeah, that's kind of how I approach it, but people have different types of ways of going about that. Another situation that you will find often is something called unicorn hunting. And this is something that is when a couple, most often a heterosexual couple with a man and a woman, they want to open things up, but they specifically want to find a woman that's bisexual to date both of them at the same time, right? So they go out there and you'll see these profiles that have the picture of the woman, but they're clearly written by the man. And it's like, hey, we're looking for somebody to just have fun or maybe more. And that's what we call unicorn hunting, right? So you think about, a line between the two of them and then one line off the middle, meaning like the horn on the unicorn. And this is considered to be a problematic practice because it basically reduces the other person to what you would call like a third, right? So the third is an accessory to their relationship, right? So there's no, it's not really egalitarian. It's an accessory to their relationship. And honestly, that's what sex workers are for, if that's really what you want. Now, if something happens organically, everybody's consenting, that's great, right? I've been in a situation where we were in a triad and that was something that grew organically, but you can't reasonably expect somebody that you're out there trying to date to, force them to have to be as attracted to both of you, right? Just saying like, hey, we're a package deal. That's not reasonable. And it's, again, kind of dehumanizing to the person that's coming into the situation. And then in situations like this, there is very often either a spoken or unspoken one penis policy, or an OPP. So one penis policy, which is, exactly what it sounds like. The guy is okay with a woman sleeping with another woman, usually because he thinks it's hot or something. So he's okay with that, but would never be okay with, his girlfriend or wife sleeping with other men or having relationships with other men. So to me, that's very unfair. It's rooted in insecurity and in patriarchy. And so, to me, unicorn hunting and having a one penis policy are kind of inherently unethical, especially if that's what you're seeking out and forcing other people into. But, of course, every situation is different. And if everybody truly is on the same page, then obviously there's no problem. But yeah, there's that. There's also other unreasonable practices like having really firm rules in a relationship. So like, for instance, let's say that I had the rule with my wife that she's allowed to go and have fun with other people, but she's not allowed to fall in love with anyone else. Right? Like, that doesn't really make sense. How the hell are you going to tell somebody not to catch feelings for somebody else? That's not how feelings work. And so people will kind of impose rules like that, or that they need to know everything about this other person, which is an invasion of their privacy, or that they have veto power. They can say, no, you're not allowed to see that person. So there's a lot of practices that people will implement because of their own insecurities, because they're not actually kind of ready to be non-monogamous. So I'm really proud of where we're at right now. I'm really proud of where I'm at right now. I consider myself, polyamorous. I'm very oriented toward relationships, like enduring relationships. And I'm certainly open to other experiences casually in different settings. But in general, I tend to like to explore depth in relationships and stick with people for as long as, is possible. Now, my wife, she is more of what you would call a relationship anarchist. She certainly would love to have relationships that are long and enduring and have depth to them. But, right now she hasn't been dating too much recently. There have been times where she's dating a whole lot more than I am, seeing, multiple people, 2-3 people around the same time and regularly seeing them. And that's great. Basically, I think her deal is that she doesn't want to have to label things or be really specific about the intention for relationships. She wants to allow them to be fluid and see what they are, see what they kind of show themselves to be, and just kind of lean into whatever feels right. So that's kind of more of her orientation. I am a little bit less that way, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, you can definitely tell that we have a little bit of different styles, but we're still kind of under that same umbrella. Now, the interesting thing is my girlfriend, she is essentially monogamous. She's only dating me and only interested in dating me right now. But we understand that this can definitely shift over time or change in some way in the future. That doesn't mean that there aren't any kind of non-monogamous things that may not happen in the relationship. It's just sort of like what things look like right now. So not everybody in the whole constellation has to have the same frame of mind or the same preferences. The important part, I think, is just consent and communication, making sure that you're talking about things, expectations are the same, and everybody understands, is on the same page. But, this took some time. When my wife first started seeing and sleeping with other men, it was very hard for me emotionally and almost more physically, right? It was a very strong physiological reaction. Intellectually, I had no problem with it. It's what I wanted for both of us, like truly. She's her own person. She has a right to do what she wants with her body. I don't own her or have any sort of dominion over her. But my primitive brain, my lizard brain, does not know that, right? So I'm like, yeah, absolutely, go do that. And then when it actually happens, my brain's like, fuck that, like danger, alarm bells. And so at the beginning, it was an adjustment. A lot of people say, oh, I can never do that. And that's the classic thing. And I would very highly encourage you not to say that to anybody who is non-monogamous. If they talk to you about it, don't say, oh, I could never do that. Oh, I can't share. I'm too jealous, right? These things can be worked on. Like jealous. Okay. That's an emotion, like a lot of other emotions that can be worked on. These days, truthfully, I feel nothing negative about my wife having romantic or sexual encounters with other people. Often I feel positive about it. Like, hey, get back out there. Like, maybe this will be a good situation for you. And really, it just took some exposure, meaning allowing it to happen and not running away from it. A lot of processing on my part, a lot of journaling and talking about it. And trying to stick with what I believe, right? Because I knew where I was intellectually, and I knew at some point my body would catch up to that. And it has. It's seriously not an issue now. I'm not just trying to convince myself of that. I sometimes forget that things are going on. It's like, oh, that's totally not even in the front of my mind. So yeah, it can be something that you work on. If you feel like you would never be able to, possibly, nor do you have to. But things like, oh, I'm just jealous, that's stuff that can be worked through, just like anything else. So that's my situation, and I hope that's a helpful primer on the terminology around non-monogamy. I know it can be confusing. It can be a bit intimidating, especially if you're like, for instance, for my girlfriend, when she first started dating me, it was a bit intimidating because it's like, wow, this is a whole world I didn't know anything about necessarily, or I was just kind of barely dipping my toe in. A lot of terms, a lot of, what feel like rules or expectations. But, I encourage anybody who's interested to do some research, especially if you're thinking about this for yourself. There are also some really great content creators out there. There are many that are terrible, but there are a few good ones, and I would highly suggest a couple of them. On Instagram, I would check out Chill Polyamory. She's super cool, just like in general. Like she's got these awesome, awesome tattoos and cool hair and like cool outfits and stuff like that. And she's so well spoken and clear in her communication. A very good resource. I also really like Elizabeth Cunningham on Instagram. She talks about sort of what her version of polyamory looks like with her various different partners and gives you tips about communication and love and everything like that. So they're both really good. And then on YouTube, while they're not primarily polyamory focused, they do talk about it. So I would check out Evie Lupine. She's really great for anything related to under sort of the BDSM umbrella, but she's also polyamorous and talks a lot about those things when they come up. And then Dr. Lindsay Doe, she has a channel called Sexplanations, and hers is just a great resource in general for anything sex education related. So those are some ideas and thoughts and resources. Let's get to actually addressing your specific questions here. You asked how the initial conversation started between my wife and I. First thing I want to clarify is that it was not just one conversation that happened. There were many different smaller conversations, kind of casual observations in everyday life and types of interactions that pointed us in the direction before we even started actually practicing non-monogamy. So there was just a lot of things that kind of led that direction, little moments and things like that. And then eventually when we were actually thinking about taking the dive and switching things up, we had a lot of conversations about that issue specifically. Some of them were more productive than others, right? I think that one thing to consider as well is that as a couple, just the two of us, we were always very open with each other and very communicative in general. And that helps. So if you're coming from a baseline where you don't really talk a whole lot, that's going to be a bit of an issue because this type of relationship style requires a ton of communication. So we've always been open. We've always talked a lot. And when we would see things that were possibly considered, strange or deviant in the media or just out and about in life, we wouldn't be like, oh God, that's weird. I can never do that. Instead, we'd just be like, that's kind of cool. What do you think about that? Just sort of talk about it. Whether that was something we saw on TV or I remember we took a deviance in society class, like a sociology class in college together. And they had a lot of different types of, people come in and talk to us, and just being open in general is a big help because you can talk about these things as they come up. So for us, there was already that baseline of curiosity and exploration. And I think that we've also been more open than many other couples in terms of just what relationships outside of our relationship could look like, right? Talking about before we were non-monogamous, if you rewound back to, 2010 or something like that, and you saw one of us with one of our close friends, it might look a lot like a romantic relationship in terms of the physical touch, the emotional intimacy, things like that. And that was just something that we, had the trust in each other and the openness with from the start. So we already had kind of more permeable boundaries than a lot of people about those sorts of things. One interesting thing that I don't know if I've ever talked about on the show before is that I also, before any of this, used to have these very specific polyamorous dreams. So I would have dreams. A lot of this was during grad school times, I think, where I was really, really stressed out. And so I was overworked for sure, driving a ton, working a ton, staying up very late, all of that stuff. And I would have these dreams where I was worried about my wife for some reason. I'm not sure what would be going on in the dream, but she would be having some trouble emotionally or physically. And I was worried because I'd be like, I'm gone. I'm busy. I'm at school. I'm working. I'm doing this stuff. And I feel bad, like I'm neglecting her. But then in the dream, I would realize, oh, wait, no, that's right. She has another partner. I would remember that she had this other partner who was there for her. She was taken care of in those moments. And it was cool. I could let my guard down a little bit and not feel guilty for handling what I had to handle because she was still okay. And so I would have recurring dreams with that theme. And I just thought that was really interesting. So the seeds of curiosity about it have always been there. And, we would joke from time to time, in college or later that someday we're going to be old and super weird. We're going to get into some weird shit together. Maybe we'll live on a compound, whatever. Right. So we would joke about it, but yeah, the openness. And then I remember there were definitely some touch points, some individual moments where the idea or the question of it came up in whatever way, and it was a little bit more serious. Oh, well, maybe so. This is potentially not the most appropriate thing, but I remember there was a show on Playboy TV called Swing, which is basically about people trying out swinging, and I brought that in and we watched it together, and we were both huh. Well, ain't that something? It was that seems kind of fun. That seems interesting. What do you think about that? And so that led to another conversation. And then eventually Joe, my wife, started reading books that involve polyamory. So she's really into a genre of books called reverse harem, which is a really terrible title for the genre. They also call it Why Choose. But yeah, so reverse harem books, and that often involves, it always involves some degree of polyamory. But many of them have sort of this found family element where it's hey, this person isn't on their own. There's a whole team with them. They all love each other. And it's it's really powerful in that way. And there's a lot of, all kinds of crazy stuff from fantasy to murder to sex and all this crazy stuff. But she started reading those books, and that also opened her mind to those sort of possibilities. So yeah, all these little touchstone points. And eventually we just started talking more seriously about the possibility of it and what it could look like. And then when we decided to try it out, it took some trial and error for sure. There were some arguments. There were some missteps along the way. There was a lot of deconstruction of things that were, insecurities or, things that either of us may have done that were not, the coolest thing to do. There was a lot of work involved in that. And then probably the biggest leap forward happened totally just by coincidence. So we had a friend of a friend who was somebody that, Joe had met a few times. I had heard of but never met. And she was at a function. There was like one particular night we were over at a friend's house who was kind of the nexus person for our group of friends at that time. And there was a bunch of people over just like, having food and doing like tarot cards and all kinds of stuff like that. And we just vibed, meaning, like I vibed with her and she liked Joe, and there was just like the chemistry was very obvious. And I remember that night kind of like getting Joe's attention across the table and being like, hey, like putting my head toward her, like, hey, I like her, And later that night when we got home, I had a text on my phone saying that this woman wanted to date both of us, like, in like a triad throuple situation. And she approached us with that. And so we went for it. And, we definitely had some adventures. A lot of you remember that period of time for us because it was pretty well documented here online, which is probably a mistake, but we all go through our mistakes, right? And that relationship didn't work out in the end. And we realized that for us, a triad situation doesn't really work too well for our relationship. I could certainly see myself in that kind of situation, outside of, my marriage with Joe. But for us, that doesn't really work well. And, so we realized that, and that was really a important part. And then, for currently, my wife has primarily dated men, but non-monogamy has also given her an amazing outlet to explore her queerness and, her pansexuality. So I can see why for yourself, you're curious about this. You are a queer woman and you feel like there's a part of yourself that you're not able to really give life and attention to. Of course, there's many people out there who are bi or pan and end up in a monogamous relationship and don't sleep with other people. So they kind of, don't have a variety of experiences gender-wise, which is, normal. But for you, it feels like there's a part of you that's not really being expressed. And I can understand that. If you're interested in non-monogamy, there's a few things that you should keep in mind. One, as I mentioned, it takes a ton of communication. It takes a lot of trust. And I would also advise that it's not best to dive into this if your relationship is already on the rocks. To me, it's kind of like having a kid to save a marriage. That's not going to help, right? And so if you're already on unstable ground, introducing non-monogamy is not necessarily going to help that. You mentioned that you're worried about broaching the conversation and your husband being insecure or inadequate. That's totally reasonable. That's completely possible. That doesn't mean it's a bad idea, though. Right? We all have feelings. Feelings are not dangerous. It's going to take some communication and processing, and that's okay. It's all right if he's insecure. It's okay if he feels inadequate. It's your job to sort of be clear in your communication and honest with him. So that would be my best advice. Be very honest. Try to make sure that you're not doing this to justify something that you're already doing. A lot of people do that, right? If they're already having, say, an emotional affair with somebody on the side and they just want to be sort of in the okay to do that, then they'll say, hey, what about this? And then their partner says, yeah, maybe so. And they're like, okay, cool, because I have somebody. Don't do that. So if you're not doing that, if you want to get into this for the reasons that you talked about, I totally understand. If I were to bring it up for the first time, I would probably say something like, hey, babe, so I wanted to talk to you about something, and I just want to be clear from the start. I'm not trying to leave. I'm not dissatisfied with our relationship. I love you. This isn't about that. I'm not giving you some sort of ultimatum or anything, but I'm just curious, have you ever considered exploring non-monogamy, meaning seeing other people? And then from there, you can kind of dive in more. You could say that you're not looking to change anything right now, that you're promising that nothing is going on, but you just want to open up the conversation. You don't have any immediate plans. You just want to explore. And then, you can look into terms and examples together, and you would maybe just leave it at that. Like, let it simmer. Let that be part of the conversation. Then you come back to it again, and you come back to it again, right? So you open it up and then you come back to it here and there. And if you ever do eventually decide to try it out, it'll be important to talk and discuss expectations every step of the way. Even if you do change your relationship and start seeing other people, you're still going to want to have some understanding about what your relationship agreements and boundaries are, both between yourselves and with other people, right? So other people, what is their right to privacy within your relationship with your partner? things like that. So a lot of talking to do. A book that I would suggest, there's a few books. I mean, one is called The Ethical Slut. That's a, kind of cornerstone book about non-monogamy. It's honestly not my favorite. It's very, very, very popular, but it's very heterocentric. It's very much for people, it has a narrow view in my opinion. There's another book called Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator that I think is actually way better. And that's one that I would definitely check out, as well as Polysecure, which talks a lot about attachment styles in relation to polyamory. So those are all good resources too. But I say, go forth, talk about it, do your research, try to be ethical, and don't come into it with the expectation that you're going to be able to change your partner if that's not going to happen, right? So explore. Best of luck to you. Okay, and before we get into the second question, let's go ahead and talk about our second sponsor. All right, this episode is brought to you by MindBloom. There is no quick fix for anxiety or depression. It takes a lot of effort from many people, and sometimes despite seeing therapist after therapist, trying different medications, different exercise routines, mindfulness, diet, all of that, sometimes what you need is something to unlock your brain and get a new way of thinking about and seeing the world. And one way to do that is through guided ketamine therapy from MindBloom. MindBloom is the leader in at-home ketamine therapy. They have safely helped thousands of people overcome their anxiety and depression, all at home. Unlike traditional talk therapy, ketamine works very quickly, and it doesn't have the side effects that are often associated with other antidepressant medications. In a study of over 1,200 MindBloom clients, 89% reported improvement in their anxiety and depression after only 2 sessions, which is wild. So right now, MindBloom is offering you guys, the listeners, $100 off your first 6-session program when you sign up at mindbloom.com/Duff and use the promo code Duff. That's $100 off your first 6-session program. So take the first step, break free from your anxiety and depression with MindBloom. Mindbloom.com/Duff. Use the promo code Duff for $100 off. All right, back to the question. Okay, so second question reads, Hi, Dr. Duff, longtime listener, about 2 or 3 years now. Thank you very much. And a fan of the pod. I had a question about how to support a partner through grief. My partner has a history of severe depression and anxiety. Couldn't go to school, self-harm, suicidal, hospitalized, etc. But his cat, named Jimmy, has helped him get through it all. Now at the impressive age of 20, Jimmy's health is failing and we don't think he'll live for much longer. How can I help my partner out during this time, especially with his history of mental illness? And yes, this is something my partner and I have discussed together. Thank you for the disclaimer there, because my question is always, have you talked about it? So thank you for writing in about this. I appreciate the question. I can tell you really care about your partner, which is sweet. So situation here is that the cat, Jimmy, has been a real emotional support and a constant for your partner throughout a really tumultuous mental health history over the past 20 years. And now here at the end of Jimmy's life, we're seeing the end in sight, and you're concerned about your partner and how you can help him when Jimmy inevitably passes. First off, let's just give a shout out to Jimmy. That's awesome. What a very, very good boy. 20 years of companionship is a long damn time. So he has done a great service. So, little clap for Jimmy there. It sucks, man. Unfortunately, all pets die. That's the nature of them. Like, we get pets knowing that we are going to outlast them. Unless it's a fucking bird or whatever, they last forever. But, people that get mammals, we know that we're going to outlast them and that... Wait, are birds mammals? What the fuck? Hold on. I'm getting a little unhinged here. Are birds mammals? No, they're not mammals. Okay. Yeah, avians are not mammals. I didn't think so. It's late. I'm sorry. I'm just going to leave that in. Who cares? But yes, for those of us who have mammals as pets, we get them knowing that we're going to outlast them, and that in a matter of years, sometimes it's just a few, sometimes it's many in this case, we're going to have to grieve them. But we do it anyway, right? And why? Because pets are awesome. And sometimes they provide a unique type of companionship that we just don't get from other humans. I know cats are, their own deal, but, any sort of pet gives you an unconditional sort of companionship that, humans come and go, but your pet's going to still be there. And it's just one of those situations where there's no perfect way to navigate it. You're both going to do the very best that you can, but there's no perfect way to navigate it. One thing I think is great is that you're not minimizing the potential impact of this. Everybody falls on a spectrum in terms of how attached they are to their animals, if they feel like they're family or what. And it sounds like Jimmy has been a very significant part of your partner's life, so it's totally reasonable for him to experience very real grief once he passes. So I appreciate you not minimizing that. You mentioned that you guys have already talked about this, and that's great. And I want to encourage you to keep talking about it. And there's a few reasons why. So first, it's probably important to make sure that you guys are both on the same page about what the end of Jimmy's life should look like. You want to make sure that's the case rather than making sudden decisions when it's time. When the clock runs out and there you are, how do you handle that? So having multiple discussions about it will help you to get your heads around what things will look like. And then also it'll give your partner space to think about whether there are particular worries that he has about his reaction or specific ways that you may be able to support him, even if that means giving space. So having some time and space to think about it is important. And the way that you're treating the situation with an appropriate degree of gravity is helpful because that validates your partner. And it makes sure that he can understand that you don't find him silly for caring so much about his cat that's been there for him for all these years. Grief, it takes time. It always does. And it's not linear. It can come, it can go every sort of which way. It's very wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey, and you can't force it. But one of the things that you can do to make sure it's going to get very stuck and not go anywhere is to just keep everything to yourself. And so by showing your partner that he can trust you with his feelings about the situation and about Jimmy, hopefully that provides a safe avenue for him to express his feelings and to process his grief so he doesn't have to hold it all inside because he's embarrassed. And then, of course, you might think about whether there's anything you can do for him when it happens, when Jimmy does pass. What can you do for him? And these can be very concrete things like signing him up for a meal delivery service for a bit or taking care of chores for him when he may not have the energy or just the, interest or motivation to manage all of life's responsibilities. The meal delivery thing that's one of my favorite things to do. Say somebody just, had a child or, they are going through some sort of treatment or they lost somebody in their life, having them, get some meals delivered or giving them like a Uber Eats gift card, something like that. It's a very tangible way to make a difference in their life and just take one thing off their plate. Aside from that, you could also get him something like a memento or a journal that he can use to write whatever he needs to while he processes his loss. If there's any kind of ritual that would be meaningful, you can also consider that. So if you're, say, burying Jimmy, or if there's anything that you would like to do with ashes if he's being cremated, you could have a party with everybody that, knew Jimmy, everybody whose life he touched. That could be very fun. Whatever makes context in the sense in the context of your relationship, I think that, that could be great. Even if that's just creating some sort of memorial object, whatever, you can do something that could be a good healing experience if that fits for you guys. On a practical note, you may also want to discuss if there are certain plans that you need to have in place or adjustments you need to make to your lifestyle or his environment to provide for safety. I don't know what the history with him is like. You mentioned all these things that he's been through. I'm not sure recently what that's been like. So maybe do you need to hold on to his medications for a while until you're sure that things are stable? Do you need to make sure that your partner doesn't have too much time alone? Are there other supportive people in his life that need to be checking in on him and staying in the loop to kind of keep eyes on him regularly? Whatever it might be, those are things that you might want to consider too. We don't want to assume that everything is going to be horrible and that he's going to wind up in crisis. But, it's important to recognize that there are possibilities here. He may take things in stride and be really surprisingly okay, or it could be very, very, very difficult and worrying. So in the event that things do become elevated, we want to make sure we recognize that there are options there. You're never going to be able to plan for everything, but putting a little bit of attention towards that would be great. And for yourself, think back on previous experiences that you've had with your partner. Have you seen what he's like in crisis or just in really bad shape? What information can you glean from looking back at previous instances? Looking back, are there signs or symptoms that you need to watch out for? Because those are the things that are associated with something like, say, self-harm, right? So what is it that you can be looking out for on your side? I don't know if your partner has a therapist at this point in time, but it might be a really good idea for him to have somebody outside of you and the family to lean on and process things. This could be somebody that he's worked with for a long time, or maybe even just having something like BetterHelp where he can easily access somebody on a continuing basis, sort of just right in his pocket. But having some support outside of the social network and outside of your immediate family could be helpful. Some people like to cloister up and spend a lot of time in their grief, and that's okay as long as it isn't becoming a form of self-torture. But you may be surprised as well at how healing and restorative it might be to maintain some activities during this time. Even if he's having a hard time with it all, maybe going out to trivia night once a week at a local pub would be just a nice little something for him to look forward to get a small break from his grief, or going and seeing some movies, or getting together with friends. Don't make assumptions that it's going to have to be the somber, deep, dark time. There may be a bit of that, but it may also be a time that you want to expand outward and experience things. It's going to take time for him, and presumably for you, to move through the grief of this. I have no idea what it's going to look like or how it will progress, but it's important to just try your best not to rush it. At the same time, don't feel guilty yourself if you are finding that you're not upset in the same way that he is, or for as long as he is, right? You may feel more detached from it and like, hey, everything's going to be fine, whereas he's still really in the depths of it. Everybody's going to react differently in their own way, and that's okay. You don't have to feel guilty for being different. And if you need support, you can definitely get that, right? So you're going to continue trying to be a good partner and a good support to him, which might mean that you need your own support. So please don't forget to care for yourself too. And eventually, we don't need to talk about this early on, but when the pain is less present and stingy, maybe it'll be time to look for another pet, right? If he knows that kind of companionship is really important and grounding for him, there's no reason he can't get another pet. It wouldn't be replacing Jimmy. It would just be the next phase of life. And, it could be, a healing experience, even if it's a little bit difficult. So he's going to get through this, and so are you. And you are a great partner for trying to make sure that you can be a good support to him. I appreciate you writing in, and I think you guys are going to be just fine. So thank you for that. And with that, that's the end of the episode, everybody. This has been episode 366 of the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. If you want to send me a question for the show, shoot me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com, and you can find the show notes for this episode at duffthepsych.com/episode 366. All right, guys, take care. I'll see you for the next episode. Bye.